Welcome to 3 Minutes of History. I'm your future history teacher, Chris Oxenford, and let's get started.
July 11th, 1864, Washington, D.C. For 3 years since the start of the American Civil War, the Union has been building strong defenses, enclosed earthworks, and it has maintained a garrison to protect its capital against an attack from the forces of the Confederate States of America. Twice before, the Confederate Army General Robert E. Lee had advanced into the northern states, hoping to knock the North out of the war. But Lee had never led his army towards D.C., fearing that the fortifications would be too strong. But by 1864, the situation in the South was getting desperate. Ulysses S. Grant had assumed command of all Union armies. Unlike previous Army commanders, he was undeterred by casualties and was determined to finally defeat the South. In an aggressive campaign, Grant had driven Lee back to the very gates of Richmond, besieging him in the Confederate capital. In the West, William Tecumseh Sherman has outmaneuvered Joseph Johnston and has been advancing on the vital city of Atlanta, Georgia. Determined to change the course of the war, Lee dispatched General Jubal Anderson Early and about 12,000 troops on a daring mission to the north. That mission was to raid Washington, capture the city if possible, and liberate prisoners. Lee hoped that this raid would distract Grant and force him to send some or all of the Army of the Potomac back north to defend Washington and stop Early. Early was from Virginia and was a lawyer by training. He had risen through the ranks of the Army of Northern Virginia, from leading a brigade to commanding a division at the Battle of Gettysburg, to finally being appointed a corps commander, one of only 3 in Lee's army, in 1864. He was skilled and highly aggressive. Early's troops left Petersburg in early June. They crossed into Maryland on July 5th and advanced toward the Union capital. On July 7th, Early's armies passed through Frederick, Maryland, and ransomed the town for $200,000. On July 9th, Early's advance was stopped for a few hours on the Monocacy River by General Lew Wallace, the future author of Ben-Hur, and a ragtag force of garrison troops. That same day, Grant dispatched reinforcements from Petersburg by sea. It was now a race between Early's army and Grant's reinforcements, led by General Horatio Wright. Washington was a heavily fortified city, but Grant had used the garrison troops to reinforce his army, and so it was lightly manned. In desperation to defend the city, Lincoln and the War Department grabbed any able-bodied and even invalided soldiers they could find and threw them into the defenses. Given the raging heat of the summer, 47 90-plus degree days without rain, it took Early's men 2 days to advance from Monocacy, near Frederick, to Washington. When they reached the city around noon on the 11th, they skirmished with the troops holding Fort Stevens. Early decided that he did not want to launch an all-out attack on July 11th, hoping to allow his men to rest, and would wait until the next day. By the next day, July 12th, it was too late. Grant's reinforcements, led by General Wright, arrived at the city's wharves and advanced to defend Fort Stevens. Eager to see what was happening, Lincoln and other Washington notables followed this advancing army. As the skirmishing around the fort intensified, Lincoln climbed a parapet, one of the walls of Fort Stevens, to see the action for himself. Sharpshooters took aim at any person visible on the fort and killed a surgeon standing near Lincoln. Someone, it's unclear who, possibly General Wright, possibly the commander of the fort, or possibly future Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, shouted at Lincoln, "Get down, you damn fool!" and Lincoln climbed down. At about 5 p.m., the Union forces advanced out of Fort Stevens and engaged Early's men. After the battle, they had suffered 300 casualties, and Early withdrew his men back towards Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley. Over the next few months, the Union Army would hound him down the valley, destroying his army in a series of engagements throughout 1864 and 1865. Early would ultimately rejoin Lee's army with the remnants of his force and surrender at Appomattox in April 1865. After the Civil War, Early would go on to become one of the chief proponents of the lost cause ideology. This ideology, prominent among the so-called Redeemers, the Southerners who were trying to overthrow reconstructed governments, sought to justify and glorify the Confederate cause. Early was one of the chief critics of James Longstreet, a Southerner who had chosen to align himself with the Republicans, and one of the chief men looking to glorify Robert E. Lee. Early himself would die in 1894.
This has been 3 Minutes of History. I'm Chris Oxenford. Thank you for joining me.